All right, so today we're going to wrap up our chapter on evolution. We're going to talk about types of natural selection. We'll talk about speciation, and then we'll talk about patterns of evolution. Before we jump into types of natural selection, let's just start by reviewing what is natural selection. If you hear natural selection, what do you think of?
What animals natural, like what meat?
The better animals reproduce, the worse ones
Process
die
by which
off.
organisms
Good.
with favorable variations
Good.
for their environment
Okay, good. So those who are like better equipped for survival, they survive, they reproduce. Those who don't make it. Okay. So today we're going to take some notes. We'll start with types of natural selection. Just a reminder, since it's been a few days since we've taken notes, you only need to write those bold words down. So don't worry about writing every single word down, just those bold words. So our first type of natural selection, it's called stabilizing selection. Think of the word stable. So this is when nature tends to favor the average trait, and it's going to eliminate extreme expressions. And a good example of this is just human birth weight. Okay, so if you think about when babies are born, what's like the average weight of a newborn baby? Okay, like 7-ish pounds. That's probably like plus or minus a little bit, right? So a little bit under 7, a little bit over 7. But so nature selects for babies in that 7-ish range, okay? Maybe more of like the 5 to 9 range. But how about babies who are born with a super low birth weight, like 1 pound, or a super large birth weight of like 15 pounds? Are their chances of survival as great as it is if you're in that average range? No. Okay, so think of that as like an example of stabilizing selection. All right, our second type is called directional. So this is when one of the extreme versions of the trait is favored. So it's going to help make that organism more fit. Or remember, by fit, it means that they can survive longer and reproduce. So a good example of this is one that we've talked about before, the peppered moths. So when tree bark is dark, the dark moth is favored. So we see directional selection where more of the dark moths are surviving, they're going to reproduce. When the tree bark turns light, which moth is then going to be favored? The light moth. Okay. So then we would see a different directional selection where nature is going to favor those light moths to survive and reproduce. A third type is called disruptive. So disruptive selection splits the population up into 2 different groups. Typically, that average or like the middle trait is removed, and you only see those 2 extreme traits. So here's an example of a snake species. It exists in like both a really dark color and a really light color. Okay, so we're seeing the extremes between dark and light, but nature doesn't favor the in-between. And then finally, our fourth type is called sexual selection. So this is when the traits get passed down based on the ability to attract a mate. Okay. So when you're thinking of mating, who's more choosy, the female or the male? Good. The females are choosy, which means the males have to develop these traits that are big and colorful and beautiful. So they've got to attract the female, so the female will pick them. Also, they evolve threatening characteristics to try to like out-intimidate the other males, right? So maybe they're going to compete for the female or even for territory so they can be near the females. So males are the ones that get these like big, beautiful, colorful, big traits. So good examples, especially around here, are like elk and deer. How many hunters are in here? Good. Okay, these are also probably traits that like you're interested in, right? So those are the traits that typically people like to hunt as well. All right, so if you look up here, here are just some more examples of sexual selection happening. So here we have peacocks. Is this the male or the female?
Male.
Good. This is the male. Here's the female. He's trying to attract her. Something that I think is interesting to think about. So when it comes to sexual selection, the traits that are preferred usually aren't going to help that animal survive. So if you look at this peacock, he has like a massive tail. Okay, by having a tail that massive, it doesn't really help him survive. In fact, if he's being chased by a predator, is that long tail actually going to be a little bit more problematic?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So it's kind of interesting to think about how sexual selection can play a pretty big role in these traits. When it comes to like deer or elk, the like larger they are, the larger their antlers become. That can make it harder to survive, right? It's just harder to run. It's harder to maneuver. The body needs more energy. But typically, the ones who are the larger, they have the larger antlers, the more likely they are to get to reproduce. So now I want to tie this back into the idea of evolution. Okay? So evolution is just the theory that states all species have come from one original species. So our species today have come from a different, like, pre-existing species. And so, just reminder, in order for evolution to occur, you have to have these 4 criteria, meaning there has to be variation in a population. So DNA has to have mutations. There needs to be an overproduction of offspring, which means there needs to be competition, so not everyone's going to survive. There needs to be some sort of struggle for existence. So we call that selection pressures from the environment, so maybe for like space or for food. And then there has to be a differential between survival and reproduction. So those who are better adapted, they survive better, they get to reproduce more, they pass their traits on. And so we say that evolution or speciation is going to occur when populations become reproductively isolated. And that can mean a couple different things. So reproductive isolation, it can just be due to like changes in behavior. So think about birds in a mating song. If one type of bird changes its mating song, it's going to make it so other birds don't recognize it. So I no longer recognize that bird is a potential mate. Okay. And then another one, this one's probably a little bit more obvious to think of, is just geography. So if somehow you're physically isolated, maybe like a mountain has formed in the way or a river has formed, some sort of like actual physical geographic distance also is going to make it so you can't reproduce. All right, so that brings us to speciation. So we just call speciation the process where members of a sexually reproducing population change so much they no longer produce fertile offspring with the original population. What does fertile mean? Good, you can reproduce. So in order for speciation to occur, meaning or like evolving new species, there has to be so many changes that when you try to reproduce with the original, your offspring can't have their own babies. Okay? Meaning like you couldn't be a grandparent, if you will. So here I have some examples of felines. If a lion and a tiger mate, what do you call their offspring? A liger. Can ligers make their own babies? They can't. So lions and tigers, they can make offspring. They can make a liger, but ligers themselves cannot mate and breed and make new ligers. Therefore, that's where we draw the line. So tigers and lions are different species. They don't produce fertile offspring. Does that like help you understand like where do we draw the line between 2 different species? Okay. All right, so on this side, you don't have to write anything down, but I like the picture. So it just shows you how reproductive isolation can lead to a new species. So here we start with the original population of bugs. Okay. Something's going to happen where they become separated. And again, this can be physical. You could think this maybe is like an actual river formed here and they physically were separated. Or you can think it could be something behavior like a mating call changed and you no longer recognize that other bug to be a potential mate. Okay. And so what happens is when you become reproductively isolated, these bugs up here, they're going to start having little changes in their population. Okay. The bugs down here are going to have little changes in their population. And over time, you're going to get more and more of these changes, and they'll add up. So if you look here, do you see how this brown population is now starting to turn green? Okay. Eventually, so many changes will happen where if they ever meet up again and try to reproduce, they couldn't make fertile offspring. And so that's where we draw the line and would say 2 new species have formed. So here's just another example, milk snakes in the eastern part of the United States. So they have been separated enough long enough where enough changes have taken place in these different types of milk snakes that they no longer could make fertile offspring. So now they're different species of milk snakes. And then finally, I want to just talk about a few patterns of evolution. Our first pattern, our textbook calls it adaptive radiation, but I think a more popular term that you'll see elsewhere is divergent evolution. This is just when one species gives rise to many species. And this happens when there's something new that comes about, like new habitat, some sort of new ecological opportunity. A lot of times this happens after mass extinctions. Okay, so think if there's a mass extinction, there could be a lot of opportunity for expansion and growth. And a good example of this is the cichlid fish or cichlid fish. One species has produced more than like 300 cichlid fish. Another pattern is coevolution. What does co mean? Like, let's say like co-captains on the baseball team. What does that mean? Together. They're both doing it. So coevolution is when the evolution of one species affects the evolution of another. So kind of think of it as like they're evolving together. So let's say the shape of flower petals might change. Well, so then the shape of the bird's beaks also might evolve so it can still get nectar. Okay, so if one evolves, the other's going to evolve to keep up with it. So when we look at coevolution, there's some different examples of it. One is mutualism. So mutualism is when two species are going to benefit each other as they evolve together. So here's some pictures of some common relationships that show mutualism. Maybe the most popular are bees and flowers. Okay, so bees, they're able to get nectar from flowers to make honey. But what do bees also do during that process? Yeah, good. They pollinate. They spread the seeds so new flowers can grow. Hopefully we keep those flower species going. Another one I like is the birds and the alligator teeth, right? They get food from the alligator. Bless you. They don't get eaten by the alligator. In return, they help pick out the gunk in the alligator's teeth and make the alligator healthier.
Isn't there something like a...
Another example of coevolution is this coevolutionary arms race. What's an arms race? Have you heard of the term arms race before? No. So there's like a side-by-side competition. Like one side gets stronger, so then the next side has to like get just as stronger, if not like a little bit. It's like one side gets better, the next side gets better. So they kind of race to keep up with each other. So a good example of a coevolutionary arms race is butterflies and birds. So birds eat butterflies. Monarch butterflies are toxic. They don't taste good. They make birds sick. The viceroy butterfly is delicious to the bird. So viceroy butterflies try to mimic the monarch, right? They don't want to be eaten. So they're going to mimic the monarch butterfly. Well, the monarch butterfly doesn't like that, right? They don't want to accidentally be eaten. They would like to survive. So the monarch butterfly is going to evolve to look less like the mimicking butterfly. Okay. And then the bird also evolves to become a little bit smarter, if you will. So to be able to tell the difference between the monarch and the mimic butterfly, so it chooses the right option to eat. And then finally, our last pattern of evolution is called convergent evolution. This is when you just have unrelated species, usually living in different parts of the world, and they end up evolving very similar traits. So if you look at the picture up here, we have placental mammals that you would find maybe in like North America, and then we have Australian marsupials. So here we have the mole and then the marsupial mole. They have evolved in completely different parts of the world. They have a different evolutionary history. But if you look at them, do they still have some very similar traits of like the shape of their nose and their bodies and their feet? Okay. And below it is just like the anteater and the numbat. So again, very different evolutionary histories, but they look similar. Another example in this class that we went over is the lactose persistence trait. Do you remember watching that video on lactose? Okay. So being able to digest lactose has evolved in 2 different places. One was like in Finland, the other in Eastern Africa. It came from 2 different mutations, okay, so completely not related, but you have the same trait where they can still break down lactose. And then finally, just the last thought when it comes to evolution is it's just dynamic, which means the rate at which evolution occurs is different. Some cases happen super fast, think viruses and bacteria. Others take millions of years. Okay, so we did from dinosaurs to birds, right? Others can be a very slow transition. So just know it doesn't have to happen all at once.